This presentation is brought to you by the MFOA.
Good afternoon and welcome to MFOA's webinar entitled Rounding Up Asset Management Tools, New and Existing Part 2, Tools, Tips, and Next Steps. Rounding Up Asset Management Tools is a two-part webinar series whereby Part 1 was delivered last Tuesday, August 5th. If you missed the first webinar, you can download the free webinar from our on-demand section on our website should you decide to learn more about asset management tools and tips. We have a very good cross-section of members attending this webinar today from small, medium, and large municipalities, so we welcome you today. And now I'd like to introduce your presenters for the day. Craig Binning is a partner with Hempson Consulting Limited, a Toronto firm that specializes in providing planning and finance advice to a wide range of public sector clients. His particular area of expertise include economic and financial impact modeling and analysis, cost-benefit assessment, user fee calculations, rate settling and local government policy, land use economics and development charges, and municipal asset management. We also have Emily Harris, who is our MFOA Manager of Policy and Intergovernmental Relations, and she has been writing about and teaching on municipal finance policy issues for nearly 10 years in academic, nonprofit, and private sector environments. We are very excited to have them here with us today. Thank you, and let's get started. Craig?
It's a pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon, and in particular a pleasure to be working with MFOA and presenting with Emily this afternoon. If we go to the topics slide, this first main slide in the presentation deck, I'll just give a really quick overview of the information that I'm intending to cover over the next 30 or 40 minutes. MFOA, as I think many of you are aware, has been working with municipal affairs in developing some material related to asset management. And as part of that process, Hempson was engaged to assist MFOA, and in particular to look at some asset management tip sheets. And through that process, in collaboration with MFOA, we've developed 6 different tip sheets that I'm going to work with you or follow through with you this afternoon. And they're outlined, as I indicated, on the first slide of the presentation material under topics. So the first thing I'm just going to talk a little bit about, reporting to council on asset management is a bit of a tricky exercise. Talk about the meeting requirements associated with Ontario Regulation 284-09. And then talk about how asset management really integrates with a wide range of kinds of studies and activities that most municipalities are already undertaking. And then the outcomes of your asset management plans, how do they tie in with your budgeting process? And we'll get into how you can do that over the short, medium, and longer term. And then try to talk a little bit about trying to encourage council to make decisions based on the evidence that's presented through these plans. And then the final tip sheet really just deals with some Q&A topics that I'll just highlight in a very overview sense. And I would also like to stress that all of these tip sheets, I believe, are available on the MFOA website for your information. So moving on to the second slide in the deck, where we're talking about tip sheet number 1 and reporting on council, and there's a few sheets with each of these topics. I think we all are aware that asset management can be a bit of a difficult topic to try to explain to both council and the public. And so increasingly what we're trying to do with our municipal clients is come up with a package of materials that helps to get council to buy into the concepts of needing to set aside money to fund the long-term repair and replacement of the assets. And it's also important that the residents of the municipality understand why that's important. And so what we're really trying to do, and one of the keys to successes that we've been finding, is providing council with that proper kind of information to make informed decisions so that they feel they're doing what is required and necessary for their municipalities. So moving on to the next slide, just to talk about under the various legislation, what are the things that you really need to provide or should be looking to provide as part of an asset management plan. Clearly, you want to identify what all of the assets are and the condition of those assets by various types of categories. One of the key things is looking at the remaining useful life of those assets, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that over the next half hour, just about how those are based on largely engineering criteria and how we need to work with those in terms of coming up with dynamic asset management plans. Also, we want to talk about the total replacement value, and we want to talk about sort of the differences between the initial emplacement or acquisition cost and what it might cost to repair and replace those assets at the end of their useful life. And one of the key things and a difficult thing sometimes to quantify is what is the consequences of the failure of the asset if we don't plan for these things appropriately, and then move forward to setting to council and the public some key recommendations on how to build reserves at what rates and quantities and levels. So moving on again, just about the asset classes themselves, and once again, under the reporting requirements, there's three key areas that are necessary to report it on, and that includes your roads and related type of infrastructure, the bridges or structures within the transportation network, and then finally the water and the wastewater assets, everything from the plants to the linear components of both the collection and distribution systems. But it's important to remember that the municipality owns a wide variety of other types of assets, and they shouldn't be forgotten as part of this process. So getting into some of the other kinds of assets that are in the roads right-of-way, streetlights, traffic signals, and those types of things, buildings, municipal buildings, fleet and equipment, and finally some of the amenities within your parklands. I was asked at one council meeting if I felt there was one particular area within the asset classes where municipalities typically fall short on, and interestingly enough, in the analysis that we've done for a wide range of clients, it's actually the buildings component. It seems like in many of the other areas, municipalities have initiated and begun good work on setting aside money for the long-term repair and replacement. But buildings is one of those things that's a bit of a shortcoming, and we're placing a greater amount of emphasis as we move forward. So just moving on to slide number 5 then, I've got a few samples here of the way that we've been trying to present information to both council and the public, and I'll acknowledge that we're continuing to try to improve this and make it more accessible. The top box there is a portrayal of the remaining useful life of the assets, and often, especially if you're a younger municipality with younger types of infrastructure, this can be a positive slide because you can see here that in this example, about half of the infrastructure has a useful life of 50 years or more, which generally means this municipality has a fair bit of time to continue to plan for that infrastructure, its repair and replacement. This municipality or that sample slide is probably talking largely about water and wastewater infrastructure with their longer useful lives. The lower part of this slide, where it's called asset condition assessments, this is one of the ones where we're continuing to try to layer in not just information about the useful life, but a bit of a more dynamic approach. We're saying, can we look at the assets, and no matter what their quantified useful life is, what is the condition of those assets? And once again, we can often get a positive story arising from this, because you can see here that it's the red portions that are in poor condition, and they're relatively small compared to the good and the fair. And it makes it just seem a little bit more manageable about what a municipality needs to do in order to maintain the assets, not only with respect to their useful life, but also the condition of those. That's perhaps further exemplified on slide number 6 for us as well, where I've got a couple of other graphs that once again talk about the status of the infrastructure. The one on the left-hand side, if you're looking at the slide, is one that often causes a bit of an alarm when I first put it up before staff, council, and the public, and it's largely because of that column that's our bar that's under the 2013 in this particular example. And that is infrastructure that's already quantified as being overdue, i.e. it's beyond its useful life. And that can sometimes be a scary number, because most municipalities are going to have a fair bit of infrastructure that theoretically is already overdue. What I try to do in communicating to council about this is if we focus on the main part of that bar, the largest section, it's the orange one, and that's roads and related infrastructure. And most municipalities are actually on an annual ongoing and basis, investing significant amounts of capital dollars in addressing immediate concerns with existing roads by doing improvements to things. And so it's perhaps a more manageable number than it really appears. The other half of this slide can sometimes create concerns too, especially for those of us from the finance side of things. And what this is examining is, how is your infrastructure deficit changing over time? And this graph is based upon a continuation of the prevailing practice of this exemplar or theoretical municipality. And what it's showing here is that the current contributions and improvements to assets is below the rate at which those assets are actually declining. So in this particular case, we actually see the infrastructure deficit increasing over time, and that can create certain problems and issues. And so what we try to do there is layer in different approaches to how one might, in a manageable way, begin to change that curve to go in the other direction. And the next slide on page 7 kind of helps us with a bit of that process. There's a lot of information here, but just to try to illustrate it for you, the bars themselves are illustrating what the calculated annual provisions should be by the different types of assets here. And most of the assets that we're looking at here are property tax supported. And then the hatched line is reflective of the current amount of expenditures in this particular municipality on improving assets or contributions to reserves. And you can see that that's about $1 million a year. On an annual average, once we do all of the calculations, the solid line moving across shows what that annual average contribution should be. And you can see it's slightly in excess of $2 million. And so in this particular municipality, we know the contributions are below what they really theoretically should be. And this helps us to guide council in saying, we need to make some decisions here to try to move us more towards that solid backline, the calculated expenditures, or else, as we saw on the previous slide, the deficit will continue to grow. But what we're really trying to do through these kinds of information is present it in a way that maybe is more manageable. And as we move on to slide number 8, as I indicated earlier, one of the things that we're trying to focus a little bit more on is moving away from the pure useful life kinds of approaches and layering in what I refer to as a dynamic approach. Because I often get questions by council in particular saying, well, you're saying all of these things are overdue, and you're saying we need to be putting all this money away, but I look out and everything seems to be operating good and fine, and are you sure we're not overstating those needs? And to be honest, perhaps sometimes we are. And so what we're trying to do is look at these condition ratings. And I think what we're showing on the top half of this slide is useful both in a static sense, i.e. capturing where things are at today in a rating of good, fair, and poor, but also based upon certain expenditure patterns and going forward, how is that changing over time? So the top box here is saying, we're going to layer in some modest increases in contributions to repairing those assets or contributions to them. And what does that do over time? And as this schematic illustrates, the amount of infrastructure in a poor condition actually shows and starts to decline over time, and the share of good and fair increases, but in a really sort of a manageable way. The lower part of the box in the same scenario illustrates a couple of things. It shows how the annual change in the reserve funds for both utility-supported services of water and wastewater and tax support are changing over time. And you can see that the numbers sort of go up and down and reflect the fact that in some years we're making some good contributions to it. But you can see, for example, in the blue line, the water line in 2012, from 2011 to 2012, there's a sharp decrease, which shows that there was a major expenditure need anticipated in that year, perhaps an improvement to a plant or replacing of some filters or a significant water main replacement program. And then the blue line continues to increase out to 2015 as the contributions are going into the reserve until the next significant expenditure need identified in 2015, 2016. So it just sort of helps both council and the public understand why we need to making these contributions into reserve. So that really rounds out tip sheet number 1, and I'm going to now talk about tip sheet number 2. And just at a high level, some of the requirements of the associated regulations. And the tip sheet provides additional information on that. But as I'm sure most participating in this call are aware, that now municipalities are really required to report annual statements on that full accrual accounting type of basis, recording the assets amortized over their useful life, and not as an expenditure in the year acquired, and they have to appear on that statement of operations. And as always, municipalities are required to prepare balanced budgets. So implementing this in a full-starch way would have had a significant, profound budgetary implications for Ontario municipalities. So the regulations were introduced to reflect the fact that we needed some balance to this. And so on slide number 10, we begin to look at what the requirements of the regulations permit us to do. And really it allows municipalities to exclude the amortization costs of some things and other costs. But it then requires you to produce the annual report to estimate what the cumulative change is arising from those accumulated expenses, and ensure that municipalities are sort of knowledgeable about that and beginning to make provision for that over time. And you need to analyze or estimate the impact of such exclusions. MFOA has done a really good, fulsome response to those regulations, and just in this document we provided a reference to the link, and I hope that's up to date on the MFOA site, to the review of that, the regulation that may provide some of you who want more detailed information at that source. And on slide 11, we've just sort of captured a proposed approach to looking at the impact of those exclusions on the accumulated annuals or accumulated surpluses, and just sort of breaks down the different components within the capital assets and how they should be recorded and identified, the post-employee benefits and some of the rules around those, and also for those of you that are responsible for waste management functions, including waste disposal and the landfill sites, recognizing that they have significant post-closure responsibilities financially, those need to be documented as well. And it just gives you a sort of simplified approach to how one might meet those requirements under the legislation. And moving on just on slide number 12, just to give a few little comments about perhaps some of the weaknesses of using an amortization approach, at least from the perspective of long-range financial planning for municipalities. Assets that are not fully depreciated, that are already fully depreciated, will not be captured in this kind of analysis. And also the depreciation approach is dependent upon historic costs and rather than replacement costs, which will almost always be greater. And so, and then the final point is that the non-tangible capital assets are not necessarily captured or considered in that kind of approach. Just to illustrate one of those components, when you look at the comparison between amortization and full cost savings, in this sort of simplified example, we've got an asset that was originally put in place in 2014 at a cost of, say, $1 million, and it has a useful life of 10 years. Well, we all recognize that the costs of inflation and such mean that when that asset expires in 10 years from now, the cost is going to be higher. And we're using an estimate here of about $1.4 million to replace it in 2024 or 2025. And the bar graph above just illustrates that if we established a reserve funding purely on an amortization approach, by the time we reach year number 10, we'd have the $1 million set aside, but the true cost of replacing the asset would actually be $1.4 million. So we'd have a shortfall of $400,000, which would require funding from some other in-year source or debenture financing. Whereas if in year one we began to set our contributions to the reserve based on the pure replacement cost out in year 10 to $1.4 million, and we set our contributions to reserves on that basis, by the end of the 10th year we'd have sufficient money to replace that asset. And then once again on slide number 2, just to wrap up a few comments, you know, it's important then as part of this to document the existing capital funding levels, look at the actual capital-related activity, document out what the anticipated provisions to reserves or asset replacements might be under that sort of theoretical approach, and then actually what the municipality is intending to do. And it should identify how much should be invested in tangible capital assets annually. And if the municipality is not doing that and fiscally maybe has restraints around reaching that, you'll want to be able to quantify those gaps and how they might be addressed in future years. So moving on to tip sheet number 3, what we were really trying to do through this tip sheet is just identify how municipalities are already doing a significant amount of information related to asset management and a wide range of other studies which should feed into your asset management plans. So everything from your development charges background study, which will have a very useful set of inventories of many of your capital assets, at least for those that are eligible for funding through DCs. Those of you that are responsible for water and wastewater services know that undertaking the full cost recovery studies has already required you to do effectively an asset management plan for those services. For decades, municipalities, through their road management plans and related software and programs, have been looking at those assets and ensuring that they are meeting standards based on various condition rating. Most of you with your fleet management already probably have in place a very effective approach to ensuring full life cycle costing of those assets and other minor capital needs. Insurance schedules can also provide some useful information. Really what I'm just trying to illustrate there is don't get too overwhelmed about the asset management and trying to think that you're doing something from the start, because you've already done a lot of good work. There's probably a lot of good information out there, and one of the benefits actually of the asset management plan is it brings everything into focus under one centralized study area or background material. And then once that's completed and in collaboration with those studies, there's lots of other ways it should and can tie into other activities that the municipality may already be doing or want to be doing on the going forward. Certainly lots of municipalities now looking at long-range financial planning, moving beyond the annual budgeting process, both from a capital and operating side, and looking at what are the fiscal stresses going to be on the municipality and how do we better plan for them. And asset management should play a key role in that. I'm going to talk about that on my next slide in a moment. But also things like growth management studies, the performance measurement requirements under the provincial legislation, and also other things that your councils may be wanting you to do. Service level tracking and analysis, and that really ties in nicely with this concept I've been discussing about dynamic asset management, where you're looking at what are the service levels that your council and your residents want, and how do we achieve those, and what does the funding mean from a funding perspective. And obviously for your financial documents, both those of the FIR and your other audited statements, all of this material is quite important and feeds into those. And ultimately, and some of you may have already experienced this as various grant programs come forward from the upper levels of government, it may be necessary to include asset management materials and long-range financial planning materials in as part of those applications to ensure that you're possibly going to receive some of those monies. Just moving on then to slide number 6, and or 16, sorry. Just to elaborate on that long-range financial planning context, this slide is a schematic that we often use when talking about long-range financial planning and building models around doing that, and it just talks about the various components to it, from everything from the demographic and information and how your residential and non-residential makeup is changing over time, financial parameters in that sort of second layer of the boxes. The key I would just want to make reference to is in the middle set of boxes, the purplish color ones. Obviously, operating and capital budgets are critical. The other one to the left, the assessment, tax, and rate revenues, is where we look at the revenue side of things. And then the one over to the right, the infrastructure repair and replacement, or the asset management box. 10 years ago when I was doing these kinds of things, I probably would have had that in a hatched outline, as many municipalities weren't necessarily integrating that. Increasingly now, because of the requirements through the province and better financial planning, we sort of insist that that be part of this process and feed in. But it's also important to recognize the box that I've got called tax and rate impact analysis in the second from the bottom line. because it's recognized that for most municipalities, if we tried to move towards a 100% contribution to those asset reserves based on the useful lives and theoretical calculations, the resulting tax and rate impacts would probably not be fiscally viable for most municipalities. And so we need to do some sensitivity testing and establishing policies and prevent sort of a meaningful and implementable kind of approach to asset management in the context of long-range financial planning. So continuing on with tip sheet number 3 in the capital budgeting, I think we all recognize that this is tying into your capital budgeting now, and it's important, we think, for most municipalities, again, reflecting fiscal realities, is to establish short, medium, and long-term goals that are achievable and saleable to your councils and to your residents. So it's important as part of that process that you continue and on a regular basis update your asset registry in terms of the assets that you have and also the condition of those and the useful life of those. And that if you can start to layer in some of these dynamic approaches and looking at your engineering and gearing it towards those, and that will make it all that much easier to do on an annual basis and to reflect on those goals that you're trying to achieve. Moving on to slide number 18, as I indicated, for the vast majority of municipalities, it's going to require a prioritization of your capital projects from the asset management perspective, because you're not going to be able to do everything that the calculations show in year one. And so it's going to require working with council and the public to establish priorities. Clearly, the most significant one will be those health and safety issues, as they're probably going to be prescribed from provincial regulations or other measures. And then there's service levels, strategic directions from council and the community, mandates, once again, it could be provincially or through your councils, the operating budget implications, obviously, and then for some municipalities, you may want to strategize in terms of economic development and continuing to support local businesses or encourage new businesses from siting in your municipalities. And I'm going to touch on a couple of those, and starting on slide 19 here. Clearly, the assets that have environmental or health risks should be considered the highest priority. And I think that's in part why the province started having us look at water and wastewater infrastructure originally, and placing the emphasis also now on roads infrastructure. But with some assets, we can reflect upon what are the desired service levels. With the roads and related infrastructure, there is a certain amount of leeway there where you can do some rehab approaches to those assets in terms of maybe allowing some cracks to appear and doing some surface kinds of treatments before doing a major overhaul of those assets that can extend those lives and can have assets that are perhaps not at the desired level of service, but at an acceptable level of service for both council and resident. And those kinds of mechanisms will help you deal and mitigate with some of the fiscal pressures arising from dealing with asset management. And moving on to slide number 20 and looking at the funding of those prioritized projects, we get into questions about, well, how are we going to deal with those things, and can the projects be funded under the existing conditions, i.e. do we have either sufficient money in reserves or sufficient monies built into our annual operating budget of the capital from current nature to fund those needs? If not, to achieve those objectives and those needs, is there going to be a significant increase required either in property taxes or the utility rates? What is that level that's going to be required? Are there some other revenue tools available that can help us assist with those things? And then ultimately, or perhaps as a last resort for some municipalities, is debt financing an approach that can be used here? Can we extend out the payment requirements and make that more palatable and mitigate some of those consequences, even though it elongates them out over a period of time? That really sort of ties in that slide with the next one, slide 21 and tip sheet number 4, which is looking at the budgeting and the revenue sources implications arising from asset management. And what we were really trying to do through this tip sheet is look at what revenue sources might be available to assist with those things. And the most typical approaches and the most readily available for municipalities in Ontario and really across the entire country are your property taxes and your utility rates. But we recognize that there's, a lot of pressure on those two revenue sources already. And so it's trying to undertake comprehensive, wide-ranging asset management funding is the best approach. And moving on to the slide 22 here, all I've done is identified the revenue tools that were examined under tip sheet number 4, and the little box at the bottom, I'll apologize for that. This was part of a presentation that I'd done for municipal affairs up in the northern part of the province, and they were doing a session that afternoon on some of these revenue sources, so I didn't get into it in detail there, but as I said, they're more quantified in the tip sheet itself. But there's things like dedicated infrastructure levies, even though it's still under the property tax, sometimes segmented or identified revenue sources are more easily saleable to councils and the public. User fees, worked with some municipalities even on the recreation side where they have a surcharge on their user fees which is directed towards asset management reserve needs, and they're looking after specific assets. Local improvement charges are, often viewed historically as introducing infrastructure and facilities into parts of the municipality. They can also be used to upgrade or change infrastructure as well. Development charges, although typically viewed as an initial round of capital infrastructure, if there's a prevailing asset that's going to be replaced and upsized, then development charges can help and assist in the funding of that. Perhaps there's opportunities to ask your developers to make some additional contributions towards some assets over the longer term horizon. Are there opportunities to do some shared servicing with joint municipalities to mitigate some of the asset management leads? P3s, public-private partnerships, are they potentially manageable? Probably limited application for many of you, but something to look at. And we've also talked about debt. So I'm just going to move on to tip sheet number 5 on page 23, as I recognize I'm almost using up all of my time. Evidence-based decision-making, and I know that's a consulting kind of phrase, but really the effective way of selling these for councils is to try to get the evidence before councils, and I typically find that if we can give them information, present it to them in a meaningful way, and also provide them with ways of trying to mitigate short-term impacts while moving along the continuum of good asset management policies, we can get them to make positive decisions. And so that often leads to the next question on slide number 24, and the one that I most typically get from councils is, should contributions be at 100% of those calculated levels? And increasingly, I'm of the opinion that perhaps we don't need to go to 100% for all asset classifications, and that really, once again, I'll use that term dynamic asset management, where we're looking at, can we focus on those design life? Can we look at those more critically and recognize that often assets have a longer life to them? Are there rehab and rehabilitation approaches that we can do that are cost-effectively ways of extending the lives of those assets? And can we continue with positive condition rating assessments that might show effectively that we can maintain and use those assets longer than those designed lives? Those things all help us to do that, but at the same time, on slide 25, I always want to leave the message with municipalities for the vast majority that there's more that can be done, and that it's important to maintain adequate levels in the asset reserve funds, and that we can be doing more, and that one approach is to try to establish a policy framework, establish minimum, maximum, and targeted reserve fund balances, and identify the funding sources for those. And on the next slide, 26, is intended just to give a high-level example of that, where, the minimum ratio may be set at a certain value of the asset class, say 20% of all of the assets within a certain category, and that's the minimum amount of the reserve. And all we're trying to illustrate through this bar graph is if those contributions, the minimum amount is, say, that $6 million, the blue portion, we're making contributions above that leading up to 2016, and then all of a sudden you have an unplanned expenditure of some $4 million, which drops the reserve fund down to just over $2 million. But if we hadn't had that minimum policy in place, that might have created some critical issues for this municipality. And obviously we've dropped below the minimum, but it gives you that chance to respond to critical or unplanned and unbudgeted events. The next slide, 27 and 28 and 29, and I'll just touch on them very quickly, identify some of those other revenue tools and some examples. Stormwater utility rates. A number of municipalities are looking to move the funding of stormwater needs out of the property taxes and into the utility rates supported. And I've given you some examples from Kitchener, Mississauga, and Richmond Hill. And increasingly, this is a growing approach across much of Canada and even into the United States. Moving on to slide 28, and this may be only applicable to a few of you, is parking enforcement enterprises, and where we set up a municipal parking division as a for-profit entity and leveraging some of the monies generated through that approach to directly assist in asset management needs. Another example on slide 29 is non-resident and local user fees, and as I alluded to earlier, perhaps you can do a surcharge on some prevailing rates that you may have in place. We use that quite effectively in Newmarket to fund some recreation replacement needs, and I've also given some examples here from Halton Hills, Pembroke, and the town of Smith Falls. And slide number 30 here is just intended to give a bit of an example of an annual tax rate impact, and just sometimes municipalities want to quantify out, well, what would be the impact associated with trying to move towards some of these increases in contributions. And a simplified example here is if the annual contribution in 2014 was some $4 million, if in 2013 the municipality had really been contributing or spending $1 million, we've got upwards of a $3 million difference between the calculated need and what was actually occurring. If in this particular municipality the tax levy was some $30 million, we can quite simply say that that gap between the contribution need and actual is $3 million over the $30 million would result in a 10% property tax increase. And we know that that is, unlikely manageable, especially in an election year, but it gives you the parameters on which to work towards and perhaps come up with solutions that work towards something in between that, which is what we were trying to look at on slide 31 here in terms of some other considerations and try to get council to acknowledge that if we can start making some move towards this, and even a small amount of dedication of funding towards asset replacement needs and into reserves has benefits going on into the future. And we can do things also, maybe ramping up the contribution needs closer to the end of the asset rather than doing it on a level annual basis. If you have debt finance a new piece of infrastructure, when that debt financing ends, rather than letting that tax room disappear, just transfer the contribution that was formerly a debt payment into a reserve contribution can help maintain those assets or other assets over the other lives. Those of you that have hydroelectric commission dividends, some of those direct some of those into the asset management needs. So those are a few high-level considerations which are given more examination in tip sheet number 5. And then just to wrap up my part of the presentation, tip sheet number 6 is really a Q&A and deals with a number of different questions dealing with full cost recovery utility studies and DCs, how often should things be updated and what elements should you be looking at, and a number of other questions. And as I said, I'll just turn your attention to that tip sheet on the MFOA website for additional information. Now, I know I've rambled on fairly quickly through 30 minutes, but I look forward to passing this over to Emily and taking some of your questions at the end of the presentation.
Okay, so thank you to Craig and Eunice for the introduction. And I also want to thank Craig and Andrew of Hempson for their work throughout the Asset Management Tools project. It was a pleasure to work with the group. I'm Emily Harris with MFOA, and I'm going to walk you through the Honor Roll, which is a series of case studies on 9 areas of financial asset management. The document was sent out prior to the webinar, so if you would like to print it out and follow along, please feel free. I'll be making page references. So first I'll head through a brief project description, then we'll head into the 9 case studies themselves, and I'll be focusing on 3 highlights from each case study. As well, there's a final section on ideas worth spreading for all of you TED fans, that were ideas that were unrelated to the theme, but still quite interesting, and I thought the group might benefit from hearing some of them as well. Okay, so for those of you who haven't seen the project itself, this is the cover page, and in case you detect a new acronym in here, I might use the phrase AMP in replace for asset management plan, just because I know how badly we need more acronyms. So onto the purpose of the project. 3 core purposes. First, we wanted to expedite staff research time for all of the staff in the field that maybe don't have time to read through 40 different municipal plans to scan for ideas and what can be learned, what can be gleaned. That was one of the goals of this project, to do some of that for you. Another purpose was to fast track the plan revision cycle. So in providing those examples and what we thought were some neat ideas, hopefully that will feed into an expedited process on revision, but also encourage Ontario municipalities to learn from some of the good ideas and best practices championed by their peers, because there's a lot of them out there. And further to this purpose, I just want to flag that in the actual asset management honor roll document, there are hyperlinks to the plans, and also there's a little snapshot of the municipal asset base, as well as the population of each community profiled, which is included to contextualize the case and enhance comparability. Okay, so as mentioned, I'm going to review 9 components of financial asset management in order of population size of the recipient. So we'll be moving from smallest to largest, and that means we'll be starting with cost-benefit analysis, because Billings, the recipient there, has a population of 506 people, and it was the smallest community profiled. So the 9 components we'll be covering are cost-benefit calculations, innovative funding and service delivery strategies, cost management, resourcefulness, financial planning, integrated long-term financial planning, forecasting, IT, and budgeting. So a brief note on method. These 9 categories weren't planned. What I did was review a whole host of asset management plans, document some of the good ideas, theme them, and then those themes became these 9 categories. So this is not comprehensive, it's just what came. Now for a couple of disclaimers. First of all, we don't endorse asset management plans as MFOA, so we're not saying that if you duplicate these plans, then you'll have a leading plan or a plan that abides the provincial guide or any of that. It's really about sharing ideas. Another disclaimer about relativity. Some of these ideas you might hear and think that if you did this in your community, it wouldn't be sustainable. And so that all depends on where the municipality is starting from, their capacity to change practice, and their capacity to change their investment levels. The last disclaimer, there's a lot of information that's not included in asset management plans quite yet. So if you're curious about an idea that's mentioned in a municipality's plan that you hear about today and you want more detailed information, I'd highly encourage you to leaf through the honor roll project itself and follow up with me after the webinar, and I'd be happy to connect you with the plan author. So today the main focus is on ideas that could be transported from plan to plan, not necessarily on how the various practices work on the ground. So I have about, let's say, 20 minutes, and so I won't be doing a deep dive on all of the ideas, but one other thing that I'd love to throw out there is that when I was contacting some of the consultants that wrote a few of the plans that are going to be covered in the next few minutes, I heard something really interesting that I wasn't expecting to hear, which was that the person I was speaking to asked if I had any feedback on the plan, and that nobody gives the consultants feedback. And I know many of you are nodding your heads or shaking your heads, thinking that you're very involved in the process, but that was an interesting comment. So in addition to thinking about your municipality and your plan today, some of these ideas might be interesting to share with the consultants if consultants wrote your plan as well. Okay, so now we're heading into the first asset management financial category, which would be cost-benefit analysis with the Township of Billings. So the first idea that they had in their plan was the kind of some proof of concept behind the idea of the increasing maintenance spending decreases overall cost over an asset's life cycle. And so we hear that at a high level pretty frequently, but I think that they went one step further and did something really interesting whereby they just compared the cost and risk of the two different options. So they looked at a replacement only, and then they looked at inspection, maintenance, rehabilitation, and replacement. So of course, the first option, the replacement only, had a higher risk and cost, and the second had a lower risk and cost. So I found this to be a very practical way of shifting the focus of asset management activities, because retaining the status quo is effectively choosing the more expensive and risky option, especially because this documentation of the cost and risk is part of the public record. It's part of a public document. That's something that's important to put out there, and it kind of suggests that a behavioral change would be in store. Another interesting part of the Billings plan was about the concreteness around some of their maintenance changes. And particularly, they recommended that another staff person be added to the maintenance team and a $5,000 increase in the annual maintenance budget. So they specified how exactly the plan or the municipality should or could update its practice, but also why. And the reason they gave was that the current maintenance budget will not allow the township to meet its level of service targets. So it was fully integrated with other parts of the plan. Another interesting idea was about the reserve fund target. And I know there's a lot of interest right now on performance management around asset management, and getting some numbers and getting some aggregate targets and getting some service-specific targets. And so one of the ones that Billings employed is about an annual contribution to respective capital reserves should be made to maintain a minimum balance of approximately 1% of the asset value. So if you're looking at starting metrics on increasing investment, Billings could be a precedent for you. Next, moving on to Berks Falls with funding and delivery. So they had a number of joint services, including fire, landfill, and rec. Some others are also under consideration, including infrequently used vehicles, joint tendering, shared road line painting, and gravel salt purchase. They did in-house and outsourcing cost comparisons for a lot of their maintenance activities, which was really interesting to see. Under each different kind of maintenance, they had this kind of high-level description of what it was, say ditching, and then the in-house cost and the outsourcing cost. So that was interesting proof of where the most cost-effective options lie. Some of the other interesting ideas were about working with Aqua to manage the water assets, and also the town indicated that it was considering operating its parabus through a volunteer group. One of the other ideas I've got noted here is about increasing road expenditures 10% over the life of the plan to reach the annual required level of funding in year 10. So that's another good metric that makes meaningful and consistent progress throughout the 10-year initial asset management plan time horizon. that will set the municipality up for unprecedented increases in investment. Lastly, rent and dispose. I found some of the plans, there was information on maintenance, there was information on, say, refurbishment, and there was information on replacement, but some of the asset management activities that have been, or that there's interest in increasing emphasis on, namely non-infrastructure solutions and disposal. Some of those didn't get into as much detail. So I found it really interesting that Berks Falls, I think they're around 1,000 population, was one of the communities that was looking at renting space for how to acquire new building space for the municipal administration, as well as disposal of assets once they reach their useful life. 3, in terms of cost management, the Township of Ignis was doing some other very interesting things. And I should do a bit of a context piece on Ignis. So prior to 1971, they had no paved roads. And come 2013, the township reported the value of its asset base at, drumroll please, $78.7 million. So that really emphasizes the need to manage the municipal cost structure. So some of the ways that they're looking at doing this are, first of all, buying used equipment and also implementing load restrictions on some of the secondary roads. Also, they developed the plan in-house with the help of a temporary employee. Another area that they're looking at in order to contain their costs is the built form. And there's an interest in developing already serviced parts of the municipality as well as infill development so that it uses existing infrastructure and doesn't create new needs that the town can't support. Finally, accurate and replacement cost data as well as actual useful lives of assets. And I found this part of cost management in the sense that it makes sure they're collecting appropriately. So, for example, replacement cost determinations are based on actual recent construction costs, contacting the construction companies for pricing, or finding it online, as well as factoring in some of the environmental inputs, like there's a low-lying swampy land, including other drivers of investment need. Like they also look at, for example, moderate levels of infrastructure use. There's not that much traffic, as well as the gravel and sand bed of the municipality, which might support a firm cost estimate. 4, marshalling resources with the township of Sterling Rawdon. So one of the most interesting things that I found was the extent to which Sterling Rawdon really did a lot of looking around and pulled in to the extent possible what's already out there about asset management, what kind of courses are ongoing, what kind of information is coming to be benchmark information in the asset management sector. So they looked at, they mentioned training provided by sector associations. They looked at service level performance measures and breakdowns of asset needs at major life cycle phases from publicly available asset management reference guides. And they also had a couple of interesting ideas around doing their ongoing condition assessments as windshield surveys for public works staff as part of their own routine patrols, and basing pavement evaluations on Ontario Good Roads Association's resource about surface distress. Another very interesting part of the Sterling Rawdon plan was that the CAO was the co-author. So it was created in-house between the CAO and the Public Works Manager, and there are some benefits, as you might imagine, of having the CAO as the plan co-author. So really a level of understanding of the technical concepts, commitment to the plan, and senior staff buy-in that's required for the plan to be useful in changing behavior once it's been approved. Finally, one of the other benefits of the in-house plan was that the staff are aware of any areas of the guide that might not align with areas of municipal practice. So part of the Sterling-Rodden plan highlights that zero debt policies should probably be reconsidered where appropriate. Fifthly, we've got financial planning with the town of Perth. So a couple of interesting things here. First of all, for anyone who's looking to get beyond PSAB estimates of useful life and looking for a reason and a concrete hook to hang your hat on in terms of how distorting some of that can be, I'd look to the Perth plan because it compares two asset replacement scenarios in terms of cost and timing. One based on PSAB 3150 data and one based on asset condition and risk. So there is a major gap. I believe it's $0 are required now at present in the condition and risk category, and I think 100 and some million in the PSAB, what PSAB would consider as due. So that's that can be a strong justification for doing some information improvements in terms of how, or the figures that are used to project needs. Secondly, there's a risk-based prioritization matrix given, and so in addition to whatever else the town wants to look at in terms of how it prioritizes assets, the plan leaves the municipality with an understanding that whatever else you do, whatever else you want to think about, a handful of the streets and the water filtration system needs attention in the short term. So it's nice to have those specific examples of what needs to happen sooner rather than later and get into that level of detail. And lastly, there was an interesting idea put forward in this plan that you normally hear about how municipalities can reduce their costs by reducing their service levels. And this plan kind of put the opposite forward, that if you increase your levels of service to improve condition, you can also reduce risk, which reduces cost. So it was interesting to see the reverse played out as well. 6, with integrated long-term planning and Brockville. Brockville is fortunate and lucky enough to have already a 10-year capital plan that can run alongside the new asset management plan. So their capital plan includes more assets than the current asset management plan. So one of the recommendations in the asset plan was about including parks and rec assets, fleet, buildings, facilities, etc., so that not only are the capital plan and the asset management plan on the same time frame, the 10-year planning horizon, they also include all of the same assets. Another neat feature of Brockville's plan was about the color-coded infrastructure report, which we'll see a visual of in a few slides' time. So there's an average annual maintenance budget column that visually reinforces the connection between technical performance and ongoing investment. As you might have seen, there are a huge range of infrastructure scorecards out there, and I found this one really useful because it just starts to get into the why of why is the performance the way it is, in addition to those color codings or A, B, C, D, or whatever ranking there is. It just started to explain and connect more maintenance with higher performance. So that might be an easier way of conveying that concept to council if there's some hesitation around upping the maintenance budget. Lastly, on Brockville, there is an affordability check on some of the strategic plan priorities. So Brockville looks at how the environmental and financial priorities in the strategic plan play with the asset management plan, and it finds that the amenities section in particular of the strategic plan about providing amenities that are second to none might be a bit of a stretch in the financial environment that the city is in. So what the plan authors say is that it is essential that the public not only be consulted, but that they ultimately be educated and make choices with respect to the service levels that they wish to pay for. Another reason this was interesting is because in the asset management plans, I found that a lot of the understanding about level of service was very technical in nature. And usually outside of asset management planning, levels of service seem to be more talked about from a public service perspective and how they interact with services rather than, say, the number of infiltrations in a year for the water system. But so they brought the service users back in midway through the plan. Now into forecasting and the City of Guelph. I'll start this one out by saying that the City of Guelph started developing its infrastructure report a full year before the Provincial guide was released, and it's quite remarkable how much of the guide was anticipated in their report. Some of the ideas that I'd like to share today are about new technical norms. For example, variable distributions for forecasting deterioration, shape parameter to describe the mean time between asset failures, sensitivity analysis to determine the impact of changing the service life, and all of that engenders confidence in estimates of useful life over the century-long planning horizon. A sidebar on that is about how the plan authors also cross-reference the asset inventory provided by staff with a previous Guelph report about the cost of sustainable services, just to make sure that the inventory used in the report was consistent with previous studies. And a few other plans did this as well, including pulling in municipal data works, just to see if the asset base was comparable between the plan and the data that's uploaded in that database. Lastly, on Guelph, the city analyzed assets that use the same material type together. And so vitrified clay pipe, reinforced concrete pipe, etc. are separate categories and pulled out individually in terms of how they're examining, for example, their wastewater infrastructure. So the idea there, and it's an interesting one, is to build an understanding of how different materials fare in local environmental conditions. And that was one of the things that was very noticeable throughout the life of, throughout reviewing a bunch of plans, is the importance of knowing the environmental conditions that surround your underground assets, and whether there's going to be movement, and whether it's soft or firm, or the quality of installation and how well they're supported underground. So one way to do that is just to pull apart the different types of assets and look at them individually. Okay, second last, we've got Cambridge with IT solutions. I can't promise to do these IT tools any justice at all, so please do review pages 4 to 7 of the Cambridge plan for details on the 15 tools that they are working on. Here's a brief sampling. They use a mobile method of uploading inspection reports. They have a maintenance management system that ensures work orders are completed on a timely basis, records trends, and updates the resource levels required accordingly. And they also use a road allowance permit system that tracks activities within the right-of-way, uploads them to the city website, and automatically notifies emergency services of closures. With all those tools, it's not surprising that they note good provider relations as one of the keys to their asset management success. So they've worked with the University of Waterloo, IBM, other municipalities, and sector associations to develop their suite of tools. Another interesting part of the Cambridge plan was that they inserted a lot of timelines, targets, and wins right in the plan itself. I'll note, though, that Cambridge started long before 2012, and so that strategy makes sense, given that there's already been so much done in the way of business process re-engineering and software development. So the plan is structured to highlight progress to date on various projects, as well as including completion times, targets, and wins. For example, with new technology and better data capture, the city has decreased infiltration and water loss rates and increased fee rates for water and wastewater to more sustainable levels. 9, the region of Halton. So Halton calculates the full life cycle cost before buying new housing assets. Some of those cost details include what-if scenarios, actual cost comparisons of similar projects within the last few years, costs associated with maintenance of the assets, energy usage, and sustainability assumptions. So a lot of work and a lot of time is invested up front understanding what the municipality is signing on to before an acquisition takes place. Another interesting idea that I know our provincial colleagues will be very interested in is that the Halton Plan makes note of the fact that in future budgets and business plans that non-infrastructure solutions, rehabilitation, replacement, disposal, and expansion will be individual line items for them. So the idea there is to track the impact of intervening at different stages in an asset's life cycle and document how much is spent on the different kinds of asset management activities, which can help draw attention to some of the strategies that might have been historically underutilized along the lines of, say, non-infrastructure solutions, maintenance, disposal, etc. Now, I believe we should probably head into questions, so I'll just skate right over the ideas worth spreading, but there are some good nuggets in there about interest income and salvaging and resale of older assets. Okay, so again, just a couple of interesting visuals about the type of revenue tools that are available throughout the different stages of an asset's life cycle. So the graph or the chart kind of suggests that it might, in some cases it might make sense to preserve room in tax and fee rates for the later in life activities and take advantage of DCs, development charges, and debt to cover purchase and installation because they can only be used at the front end. Next is that infamous Brockville infrastructure chart about the condition estimate of their assets, but also with this column at the far right about the average annual maintenance budget that helps reinforce the connection between condition and maintenance. Next, if anyone is looking for other municipalities that are trying to move beyond the 10-year time horizon set out in the provincial guide and needs a good couple of reference points for who's done that before, Cambridge is certainly one, and I think that first purple bar right after the plum bars might be justification enough for some councils just to know that's the type of thing that could be lurking right around the corner if with the shorter term planning horizon. Lastly, right before we head into questions, there is a revision log here from the City of Guelph, which is a good way of monitoring consistency between the plan revision cycle articulated in the plans themselves and the timing and scope of the revision undertaken. For councils, it also indicates how much staff time has been invested already, that the plan is an active living document. Okay, so Now that we're at the close of the second part of the second tools webinar, I just want to put in a plug for the virtual library where there are a host of other asset management resources. And you can also send in ideas about what topics could be covered in future under the asset management banner in the virtual library to policy@mfoa.on.ca. And as well, there's the opportunity to upload any asset management reports or plans or research that you've done in your municipality that you think your colleagues would benefit from seeing. Here is our contact information. And of course, thank you very much for joining us today. And we're really looking forward to your feedback on the webinar, technical glitches aside.
All right, thank you so much, Emily. So right now we're opening up for questions and answers. So there were a couple from the beginning for Craig. First question, based on slide number 4, you had talked about various types of infrastructure. What about IT infrastructures?
Well, yes. I mean, it depends upon how you're classifying the assets. I think depending upon the nature of the IT equipment, some may not classify that as a tangible capital asset. But you're quite correct that if your approach is, then that would be important to include under that category of the other assets to think about.
All right, so for the next question, we have, for municipalities beginning the asset management process, can you speak to where an organization, an asset manager is located, how they link with various business units, how they report and coordinate, etc.?
So is that one directed to me?
Yes.
Right? I don't know whether Emily might have more insight in terms of the structural organization of staff brought in for a specific asset management purpose. That's I obviously deal with someone who's been retained or hired for that specific function, but I don't know from the hiring and locating within the org structure how they fit in really.
Okay, so I guess there's the two classic approaches and then the hybrid, centralized and decentralized. So for example, the City of Edmonton is probably the most famous example of a centralized asset management function, and they have an Office of Infrastructure. Then the decentralized option where each department manages their own assets is another that's also used widely, and then the hybrid, a bit of both. So I won't endorse one or the other, but in the centralized model, I believe there was an ISO note. I don't remember the ISO number, but there was a bit of a preference suggested for some of the synergies that could come from doing all of the asset management work in one shop. And if you're going to go decentralized, the idea there is just to kind of get everyone up to a learning curve and build asset management capacity within the organization so that it, say the parks and the rec facilities can be managed at the same level of excellence that the roads are managed and some of the assets that there's more familiarity with on the part of municipal staff. So it depends on, there's no right or wrong way. I think Calgary is part of the decentralized model. It's really, I've heard centralized can be more expensive. I would trust that it depends entirely on how you set it up and what your goals are.
All right, thank you very much. And there's one last question. Where would people be able to find tip sheets on the website?
I can take that one, yeah. So once you're on the MFOA website, the policy tab is the second to the right, I believe it's second to the left, and then the opening page, once you click that policy tab, is a list of projects. And so the second project in that list is about new asset management tools. So if you click that, the list of tip sheets is included in a whole host of documents on that page.
All right, so thank you very much for joining us on today's webinar. For additional resources on a broad range of topics, please visit MFOA's virtual library. The library is your one-stop shop for policies, RFPs, guides, legislations, and regulations from across the province. Visit www.mfoa.on.ca/library today. Thank you. Bye for now.